Hello, this is the Future Builders podcast created by Aluprof, where we talk about the future of design, architecture, construction, and much more. Why? Because our slogan, our motto is, let's build a better future. So let's talk about the future and keep making it better. My guest today is Tomasz Pągowski. Hello, thank you for having me. A designer and host of shows about interior decoration. We dig deeper than just decoration, but yeah, in general, we deal with interiors and with the psychology of those who inhabit these interiors. Psychology is important then. We need to understand them so that their interior can somehow mirror them. Well, in general, I think it's crucial. So in this context, every designer should have a bit of a psychological intuition and listen more than make suggestions. Or they should make those suggestions after they have listened well and drawn conclusions. So basically, yes. Designing your living space in this general sense, so to speak. Since the leitmotif of our conversations is the future, today we'll talk about the future of design. But before we do that, I would like to ask you what the starting point is, in your opinion. Or, in other words, what is the current condition of design? We are at a bit of a crossroads, and have been for at least a decade, or two actually, because entering the 2000s and beyond, we have already entered an era of mixing everything with everything. These existing basic styles have already been exhausted, and people started to wonder how to combine them in an attractive and fresh way. So this mix continues, and at the moment, the next steps basically result from the development of technology. And here, in this context, we face new possibilities, both in terms of materials and size, since it's also a matter of the properties of the materials themselves, used to construct things, furniture, but also houses themselves. But in your opinion, can today's design be still somehow surprising? It surprises us all the time, and I think it will continue to surprise us. It is true, however, that most of the industry cannot wait to see what new things they can offer to their clients. And when it comes to naming trends year to year, there is more and more verbal acrobatics, making some stylistic oxymorons and whatnot, just to say something new. So we have the same mix, but let's call it that now, so that our client sees it as a breath of fresh air. And the air is still the same, right? Well, at the end of the day, yeah, I understand perfectly that in that moment, it's a kind of desperation, searching, looking for something fresh, coming up with something we haven't combined with this and that, what has been fashionable for the last 3 seasons. Okay, this has already been fashionable, it seems, we've exhausted the topic, let's add something to it so we can create a new quality. Sometimes it works, and at other times, it's just old wine in new bottles. If we break it down into Poland and the world and compare these two worlds, is Polish design doing well, bad, better compared to the world, or worse? I mean, I would look for the division on a different level, because nowadays it's not a question of Poland versus abroad, West versus East, but it's rather about the customer, the target recipient, but also about someone who offers something on a given market. So it depends more on the awareness of the designers and manufacturers themselves, and of the customer, of course, than on the specific region in the world. In every country, we can find a bit of unrefined style, so to speak. Every country has something amazing to offer, and Poland has nothing left to prove in this respect. Because we have already proven ourselves from Shanghai, we can easily say we're at the top, at least when it comes to our truly progressive designers and architects. Now, if we think about our interior design, what trends can we talk about? What are the guidelines and tendencies? I mean, the thing with fashion is becoming more tricky, because we are starting to realize, in a purely social, even civilizational sense, we have hit a certain wall. There are certain problems, issues to be solved, which are more or less burning in some circles. Some even openly ridicule them, such as the concept of the climate crisis, ecology as such. So there is a strong dualization of society here, and it is visible in every country. It is true, however, that there are problems that should be be uniting us, and they should certainly force some solutions, even if only so that those who actually care about the future of the industry, but also of the whole world, have to come up with something to stop certain processes or direct them so that we, as a civilization, are not caught with our pants down, so to speak. So, of course, there are the progressive parts of society, but also part of the creative industry that thinks about the future in this context, and it kind of provides a common denominator of real needs for the future. And in this respect, we need solutions. And here it seems to be less and less appropriate to talk about fashion. A trend is something more neutral, and the trends currently clearly indicate the need to create while taking into account the issue of climate neutrality. Responsible design that does not interfere with nature, even helps it breathe a little and regenerate in its annual cycles, right? So in this context, this is where I would see the dry land, so to speak, while we still have it, so that we can build preferences for the future. So nowadays, throwing out slogans such as industrial, loft, rustic or glamour, it's a bit like, well, let me just say, personally, I think it's a bit inappropriate to use certain concepts in this area. That's not the point, because setting aside the fact that we are in a total mix, so like these classics, everyone knows, of course, how to style them, and which components of a given style are appropriate to fully represent it. However, it is not the styles themselves that are the essence, but the processes and solutions that require technology, materials, and operating the production and recycling cycle itself, among others. So now we are looking not only at the thing itself, but what it's made of, correct? Yes. And it reminded me of something. We had a very interesting debate at 4 Design Days about how generations Z and Alpha see the world. What solutions, what kind of world they expect. I had a pleasure to be there with my son, who is a Zoomer himself. We also called on architects and designers, as well as sociologists and other people having influence on social awareness and technological solutions, among others. And one of the basic points that Gen Z address is we should know what something is made of, where it was made, in what conditions, how much energy and water it used, the entire process, how long the supply chain was. All this is important for Gen Z, regardless of whether they are in the industry or not. They need to know where it comes from and where it goes. And they are kind of a key to this process, because they, as consumers at the end of this chain, receive something and want to have a sense of being okay with what they represent in the world and what example they give, to their own generation at least. But when we look at the carbon footprint of a certain product, do we think about its form at all? Or is it not that important anymore at that point? Well, I think that the next generations will be much more practical than the previous ones, that certain forms have already been created. In fact, most things have been produced in a way that is acceptable to humans, in terms of ergonomics, aesthetics, and the general sense of comfort, including the purely energetic sense of comfort when in contact with a given object. And here, I would rather not go for any futurisms that dominated the 1960s or 70s when the space exploration began. There was a whole range of films, science fiction and other such activities, including books, and it started with our native, Lem. So, certain things were articulated, shown, and materialized then. People had the opportunity to come in contact and interact with it. And I think the X and Y generations certainly did, because they generally started to escape into the world as nomads who are looking for their place in the world without this clear attachment to material possessions. Gen Z, not Alpha though, they are still a bit too young to make such clear and conscious consumer choices, but Zoomers definitely need to have this natural relationship with objects. So there is no need to experiment with form here, unless we come across materials that will allow us to do something on a larger scale or to improve an object in terms of monolithism, make some improvements there. One thing is for sure, though, we want to be closer to nature. This is the priority now, not fancy shapes and detachment from the reality of the world we live in. You touched on the topic of science fiction and futurism, so now we can smoothly move on to our main theme, which is the future. And I have a question about science fiction, because I don't know if you follow the latest science fiction productions, but I'm sure the issue of interior design and furniture always catch your eye. What do you think about interior design in science fiction? Because sometimes I have the impression that instead of the future, they actually show the past. I mean, we know that we're always looking for archetypes everywhere. I'm quite close to the film industry, so I understand the priorities and objectives of filmmakers in this context, not only in terms of style and aesthetic, but above all, in terms of psychology. This relationship with the viewer who, despite being launched into space, still identifies with the characters and the more psychological aspect of their reality, because the psychological mechanisms are the same. And it's just a matter of the environment in which certain plot lines and intrigues unfold, right? So in this context, I think that there was a certain shift some time ago. Because I remember, I mentioned earlier, this fascination with futurism, this search for cosmic forms for all everyday objects, the sterility of rooms, this dehumanization of living space. So it's definitely not a thing anymore. We've seen enough of that already. What's more, the cinema itself seems to have washed away our craving for this space, which is a silent emptiness, you know? And these interiors are also synonymous with the existing atmosphere, so we definitely don't want that. In films, at the moment, when it comes to that, it's been known for some time that dystopia makes for a good plot. The post-apocalyptic features of all films and series, because there have been a few spectacular ones in recent years, they show a longing for what is associated with home, warmth, a sense of security and stability in life, rather than resorting to some abstract forms that are or may be appropriate in the future. Although the forms here are quite a relative and unlikely concept. I'm thinking in the context of AI and artificial intelligence, and in general, let's call it maybe eventually an independent entity that will somehow bring a new quality. It's already bringing a new stylistic quality, leading us through various code-triggered solutions. So you can already see that illustrated in artificial intelligence, that we're dealing with some kind of new stylistic forms, for example, within graphics. But I understand and see clearly that in a moment they will move into much more tangible areas of artificial intelligence activity. It's possible that it will unveil some solutions that were unavailable to us due to the very fact of following some established patterns. Of course, everyone breaks their own rules at one point or another, and each generation has the need to go out there and explore the peripheries of our civilization. But we're still made up of a certain genetic code, and this determines us in some way. I wonder, I am open, but on the other hand, we know, of course, that AI is also based on what makes up humans, who are also biased and subjective. We know that the first research shows already that the reflection and calculations are biased, because they seem to result from the view of the world of programmers' priorities and preferences. From the sum total of their experiences. Exactly. So this may break down at one point when artificial intelligence starts to learn about itself and learn about the world independently of data provided by humans. So a lot can happen in this respect. But when it comes to going back to the style and the aesthetics of the future, I think we have realized that we are at a point where technology will continue to develop. but it will be other areas that will be the subject of technological activities as part of the necessary activities. Priorities will change. We don't need that at the moment, and we know it perfectly well, even though recently there have been attempts to fly into space again. What's important to use is to repair the planet that we are starting, which has been clearly devalued and destroyed by us, and its resources are running out. So in this respect, I think it's actually a very optimistic vision, because I can see several futures, and I don't want to speculate here, but I simply want to affirm the better solutions rather than the destructive ones, which would seem quite obvious considering what is happening in the world at the moment. Because there is a lot going on in politics and societies, with so many unknowns lying ahead of us. So everyone takes a breath and holds it. However, by affirming the positive and what should happen based on what we can already see happening, I assume that technology will serve not so much man, but rather nature, which will allow man to continue to exist here and now. I think a cool example of this futurism from years ago is the animated sitcom The Jetsons by Hanna-Barbera. It showed this kind of fantasy and how the future might look like, according to the producers, and now I have the impression that because of that, science fiction is now a bit mundane. Designers lack fantasy? What do you think? I think we've just had a fair share of flying in our imagination, and these fairy tales are lefts. I mean, they were needed to spark something, to look for solutions. But when was The Jetsons made? In the 60s? In the 60s, right. So it's been a while, hasn't it? And what has happened in the meantime? Do we fly? No, we don't. However, the things Stanisław Lem himself conceived somewhere in the process of creating his stories, many of those things have come true, but only those that involved our direct relationship with specific objects and our needs in relation to technology, right? So these types of tangible things, it turns out that they kind of became real and are now in use. So how will our lives look like in, say, half a century? What will our apartments look like? Which direction are we going to follow with design? I don't dare to speculate. I mean, I think that I will stick to my opinion that there may be several futures. It might be different futures for everyone. And at the end of the day, we just don't know. In general, the times we are living in make it quite difficult to make judgments about the future. Because while 20 years ago, when we were entering the new millennium, and there were also various musings about this new millennium, what might happen, and that something would definitely happen. It was still about playing with science fiction. But now we have some genuinely real threats here and now that we know will escalate, both in terms of security and climate issues. I mean, in both cases, it is about security. Only one is the result of human greed and short-sightedness, and this tribal thinking, and the other is objective in relation to everything we have already committed. So in this context, I think that soon we will simply be forced to put all our eggs in one basket of pro-green activity to protect a certain increasingly fragile ecosystem that determines specific changes within the annual cycle, because it is largely in danger at this moment. And no one knows what will happen if one piece of this whole puzzle falls out. Because it is an avalanche of cause and effect, the domino effect begins. So no one knows. We know these changes are happening. Most people ignore them, going, oh, you know, there was the Ice Age before. Who knows if the droughts were there too? But we weren't there. So we don't know. I mean, we were there a bit in the Ice Age, but we were looking for other directions. And there were only a handful of us, not the 8 billion that are now. So it is also an issue that requires very careful consideration. And here, returning to Earth and our trends, I think that the key, I think it's already starting, referring to Gen Z, when it comes to the quality of life, the quality of living space. They've stopped prioritizing square footage and are now focused on quality instead. And that's the key. And the quality, in turn, it contains the origin, materials, their value, their recyclability. So we're not talking about quality here, meaning a Gdańsk wardrobe that will last us 100 years, correct? Well, it can last more. As a conservator of historic wood, I could go on, but I don't want to. But I do think that these are some luxury items that, of course, have their cultural and historical value. For example, the Gdańsk wardrobes, where cornices, by the way, were up to ½ meter long, so nowadays we can also see it as a waste of material. We can keep something like that in a museum. If someone inherited one from their ancestors, then of course it's a treasure. And it should be taken care of. Modern solutions, however, will clearly be based on the use of the least amount of materials possible, so that the materials are as easy to obtain as possible, so that they are materials that are not harmful to nature, and we can quickly recreate them. So, for example, oak tables. They are nice to have, but we will have fewer and fewer new ones. But thinking about bamboo and other things of this type, of hemp and prefabrication of this type of materials, it makes the most sense to talk about it, and that's what's happening. I had the pleasure to participate in such a debate recently, where such new technologies were put to discussion. If not plastic, then what? And if plastic, which we have to somehow process, and we are still not ready to do it, in a, let's say, financially viable way, right? Because of course the technology is there, but it is still unprofitable. It's not profitable for people in the long run, because there is always a gap in the chain somewhere. So that's waiting on the sidelines. We know that we shouldn't keep creating new things. We also know that plastic has its limitations, and after some processing, the interatomic bonds get broken. So you need to add more. So there's constant change here, constant evolution, and in this context, the technology is necessary to grasp new opportunities from what we already have. There was this very strong slogan, I can't quote it literally, but the idea was that in the past, to find resources, you would go to the forest and bring wood and whatnot. At the moment, our resources are garbage dumps. That is where the raw material of our future is. That's where we should draw from, because it's our making. This is the resource we should learn to exploit, and we have to do it so as not to simply drown in it. So in this respect, this is the type of social change, the type of future that awaits us, whether we want it or not. So this is much more certain than fantasizing about style trends. Let's go back to the here and now for a moment. When it comes to architectural trends, it is safe to say that architecture has fallen in love with large glazing. In fact, Aluprof is witnessing this because we are making these systems larger and larger, and there are more and more open spaces thanks to that. I can throw in a quick compliment here, because the very fact that we should be limiting our living space, and we can do it, the fact that people used to make tiny windows resulted simply from them losing energy the fastest. On the other hand, we need light. The times that are coming, though, we are so uncertain that, on the one hand, we need to be able to have as much light as possible, especially in a smaller space. But also the technology in this respect has advanced so much that, at least in double-pane windows, we now have insulation on both sides. That if we are facing drought and overheating, they inhibit the interference of temperature inwards. And if we face another ice age, we are also protected better here, when it comes to the heat being released by the building. So this is an example of good technological progress. That on the one hand, we have more opportunities to use more light, which improves our well-being and meets our need to have a relationship, even with what's outside the window. Or it provides us with more opportunities to do all that, with no losses in the area that used to force us to limit the amount of light in the rooms. So this is one example that we already have at the moment, but others are definitely coming, and I look forward to them. In this context, I wanted to ask you about the challenges when it comes to interior design, because if we have larger and larger glazing, there's no place for a wardrobe, no place to hang a painting, because there's a window. Doesn't this limit you in some way? Is it a challenge? I think that people are more and more aware in this respect. In the past, we didn't realize. I mean, professionals did, of course, but the recipients, users, not so much. And therefore, they had slightly different requests and expectations for architects and designers that, as we enter spaces, we should be approaching the source of light, but not necessarily work in spaces where we will have eternal darkness, right? So it's also the energy balance that comes into play here, that apart from the fact that the glazing itself is currently much more efficient, energy efficient, and retains heat, we don't need it so much from the north, as long as, of course, the house is well oriented. So in this respect, I mean, I'm speaking from my own experience, because we're building a house now, and the experience is almost mystical, because it's my first house. I've had many apartments, but this is the first time I'm building this little house. And we also seem to be following this path of downsizing. We want to prove to ourselves that we don't need square footage. The most important thing is that the square footage we have is a conscious decision. So we adhered to the convention of 750 square feet, exploring what spatial and functional possibilities it offers. So in this respect, I suggest if anyone had any doubts here that large glazing means less storage, you just need to dedicate the space well. Choose a point where, firstly, there will be light, secondly, there will be a view, and the remaining spaces, planes and walls, should be envisioned in such a way that, of course, you have some kind of preview there, but also so that they can be adapted for storage and similar purposes. Let's move on to the penultimate question. Tell me, how important this line between functionality and form is? Because it's easy to cross this Styx and go too far in any direction, right? Oh yes, this is often treated by designers as an internal war of sorts. A battle over what at the expense of what and why. And most designers have these ambitions. The balance is being tipped in favor of aesthetics rather than function. But I speak for myself and from my own experience and perspective. I always use function as a starting point, especially if we are talking about a relatively small space. Because you can have a bag in various styles, but if you don't have one, you have nowhere to keep your things in. So in this respect, it is worth, first of all, being aware and mindful, going through this whole process of your own logistic and functional examination of conscience, what we need, what are the ranges, what the percentage of individual storage is, when it comes to the wardrobe with clothes, how many clothes are hanging, how many are lying around, how many laundry baskets we need, and so on. And that's where our core is, the starting point. It all has to fit somewhere, which in turn causes limitations that result from the fact that it all requires space, in the sense of general perception and feeling of that space, which is not so much a limitation but a challenge to then address it in such a way that, first of all, it doesn't give this impression of taking away and invading this space, but something that is somehow absorbed into the wall, but can also be a decorative layer, and define the style of the room in a way. And we always follow this approach, and I never assume that it is something at the expense of something else. These are simply the conditions I work with, and my task is to use them. They are tools. We treat limitations as a different kind of tools. As a result, we get rid of unnecessary dilemmas. People could do anything, but until you face specific limitations, you can fantasize. The moment you know that you need a wardrobe here, you need this here, and that there, you start with these blocks, and suddenly it turns out it's getting smaller. I've got it. I can see the dry land. And we can reach the shore on this principle, and only then we can decide on stylistic issues. And here, I also return to what we agreed at the beginning. The issue of psychology in the relationship with the client and investor is the key to ensuring that everyone is satisfied. You could, like Stanisław Wyspiański, go the other way, where only aesthetics mattered. And then Tadeusz Wojżeleński unfortunately had to complain in his poems, "Let's draw conclusions from history." Exactly. I was intrigued by one more topic, so it would be great if we could touch on it. Artificial intelligence. Do you think it could be put to work in design? And maybe, do you already use some of its elements? It's already being used, yeah. To what extent will it be helpful? And to what extent will it take the jobs of designers? Well, these debates have been going on for 2 years, at least. At least that's how I remember it, when the first speculations began about what would change and what it would bring. At this point, I am convinced that it is particularly helpful in the design industry. When it comes to organizing the design process, putting things in order, picking out certain things for us, selecting these matters and suggestions that the human mind must verify in the end. And at least in terms of this theme of empathy in the relationship with the client, we can't do it at this level yet. And this is perhaps the last resort for designers. But this is still a point where it is clear that a human being is needed. You need someone who understands the needs of another person. Two people are able to relate to each other. They are able to go through certain processes, not only project-related, but processes related to functionality, size, and the things you can calculate, but also those related to sensuality, relationships and energy, those which, for now, cannot be accessed by artificial intelligence. There may be something around the corner, but for now, we don't need to worry. We know, though, that every type of development and technology takes away someone's jobs in some industry. You had factories when the industrialization started. People were like, we will all lose our jobs. Of course, some did, but retraining still gave people a chance to find another job. So for now, opportunities, not threats. I mean, it's worth looking at it this way and take what's best from it, the things you can use for your advantage. It's no use to try and run away from it, after all. The issue of tools we use influences our efficiency in any given industry. And I think people who get the hang of this technology have it easier, and they arrive at certain solutions faster. Thank you very much for the interview. Thank you. My guest was Tomasz Pągowski, a designer and presenter of TV shows about interior design. Don't miss the next episode of our Future Builders podcast. Thank you, and see you soon.